Good morning. So my name is Alexandra Rouch, and today I'll be presenting my paper, Spectatorship, Desire, and the Queer Female Body, Representations of Lesbian Sexuality in Contemporary Cinema, which was a research project I did in the summer of 2019 with the Meredith College undergraduate research program and my advisor, Holly Fisher. So I'm going to apologize in advance for having to not be able to full screen it. Zoom is being hateful today. Okay, so a lot of you have probably heard the phrase the male gaze. And just for simplicity's sake, we're going to define that today as the way of conceptualizing how female bodies are presented in traditional cinema. Okay, so the phrase the male gaze is attributed to feminist film scholar Laura Mulvey, who essentially defined this as the way that women's bodies are often fragmented in film. And this GIF here is a great illustration of that. This was from the 1994 film The Mask, and this was the first time this character was introduced, but instead of learning anything about her personality or her subjectivity or her personhood, you essentially just get her legs and her breast and a dramatic hair sweep. And Mulvey called moments like this in film moments of erotic contemplation, where essentially the narrative flow was paused in order to linger on a woman's body in a way that did nothing to add to the story itself, and instead was simply a removed moment created for the male viewer to appreciate a woman's body. And this relates to an idea that is common in film theory known as the idea of the ideal spectator, which essentially is the belief that every piece of media, and particularly film, is created with an ideal viewer in mind. And as with most things in Western culture, film is aimed at a white, cisgender, heterosexual, male ideal viewer. Okay, so we talked about the male gaze, but what's the female gaze? So this tweet really eloquently sums up the complexities of talking about the female gaze. You know when you see the male gaze, where we've all seen it as long as we've watched film or looked at advertisements or anything like that. So the picture on the left is a great representation of the male gaze. It's framed so that her breasts are emphasized, she's wearing a tight, ripped up shirt and kind of an impractical outfit. Even just from the still, you get the sense that this is posed for a viewer, specifically assumed a male viewer. First, the one on the right doesn't necessarily feel posed, but I don't know if I would agree with the tweeter who quote this, that it's necessarily the female gaze. It's just not quite the male gaze. But in discussions of the queer female, or excuse me, the female gaze in general, the biggest issue is the idea of identification. And scholar Mary Ann Doan believed that because women are so constantly surrounded with images of themselves and inundated with images of sexualized women, it becomes really hard for them to get the necessary distance that creates desire. Because what is desire but a lack of something? When you're surrounded by something, you can't necessarily desire it. She believed that for women, seeing an image of a woman necessitated a becoming. However, she was talking about a heterosexual female viewer. For queer women, it's a little more complicated. I used to have this running joke with a lot of friends about Scully from the X-Files. We always said, do you want to be her or be with her? And that really is the crux of what is complicated about a queer female gaze. There is not any sexual difference in terms of physical differences between cisgender men and women that might create, a space for desire between a woman maybe viewing a picture of a man, but obviously there has to be some sort of a desire, and desiring experience taking place for queer female viewers. So how can that happen without that difference? And so I believe that is tied to actually utilizing identification, but we'll get a little bit into that as we move along. Okay, so there's not been a lot of concrete discussion of the queer female gaze. A lot of people have talked about it, but in always, as with a lot of theory, in very abstract terms. So scholar Teresa Delorda suggested that for the queer female gaze to be created in a film, you need the creation of a fantasy space where essentially you have two fully realized female characters in mutual desire, and watching that creates a setting for desire rather than necessarily a single object. Now, Jackie Stacy talked about a couple of films that were more heterosexual in nature, All About Eve and Desperately Seeking Susan, both of which were revolved around a young woman who was obsessed with like the glamour of another woman and wanted to become her. And she believed that this was a very specifically female spectatorial experience that did revolve around the ideas of difference in desire, even if it wasn't necessarily sexual in nature. So scholar Claire Watling actually suggested that you need a transaction with the text to create a queer female spectator position. So there's an idea in literature theory called reader response, where essentially there is a belief that the meaning of a text is created by a transaction between the text and the reader. And that was the basic gist of her definition of what a queer female gaze might be, is that a woman would have to almost read against a text established meaning to create that queer spectatorial experience. So going off of these ideas, I developed some basic, qualities that would be present in the queer female gaze and began to use this to develop my own rubric. So these basic qualities are that the gaze identifies rather than objectifies, and that's related to that creation of a fantasy space, because that is necessary for identification to take place. And then all of this is based in an interaction with the text rather than simple observation. So to do this, I decided to create a rubric to assess the films I watched for this project, where I looked at cinematic language specifically, focusing more on what was concrete in the film that could be quantified a little more easily than just talking about abstract experiences. So Mulvey talked a lot about cropping with the male gaze. The body is often cropped in on. In the female gaze, that sort of cropping complicates the identification that is necessary because it sort of reduces the women to parts rather than persons, essentially. Likewise, in the male gaze, it's this moment of interruption of narrative where it is almost lifted, the moment of erotic contemplation is lifted out of the diegesis of the story. Whereas in the female gaze, in order to preserve identification, it would still need to be relevant to the story, and also to create the setting of desire, you would also need to have it remain in the setting of the story, essentially. Likewise, cinematic language outside of cropping, so music, lighting, so on and so forth, with the male gaze, in order to create that othering moment where the body is ultimately objectified, a lot of times there was a change in lighting. So, lighting, contour lighting, essentially. Whereas with the female gaze, that can happen in terms if it creates a mood, but generally, if it happens so much as to make the scene feel like it is no longer part of the same story, then it disrupts the fantasy space. And thus, female gaze films would not, essentially demonstrate that same quality. Okay, so let's get out of the abstract for a moment and just talk about how this might look. So I'm assuming that no one watching this could identify these actresses. And that's exactly how the male gaze works. This is actually Megan Fox and Amanda Seyfried in the 2009 film Jennifer's Body. But this scene was essentially made up just of shots just like this, where it was cropped in so much that they no longer had any identifiable features. The lighting, as you can see here, is very flattering kind of mood lighting, but it was completely different from the rest of the story. It was otherwise, very conventionally, filmed film in terms of the cinematic language, and it was a regular kind of campy horror film, but it was not this sort of lighting throughout. Likewise, the scene had no narrative significance. You can't really obviously see that from the clip, but it essentially took these characters that had been otherwise very well developed and reduced them to bodies in that moment. And the scene was never talked about again. It was simply this prolonged makeout scene, essentially, where it was entirely based in shots of their bodies and flattering lighting with mood music, and did not create any sort of space for identification because the characters became less than people. They were just bodies at that moment. Whereas in this film, A Perfect Ending by director Nicole Kahn, I believe was released in 2012, there is so much space for identification here. First off, not cropped in any way. You can still clearly see both characters. Likewise, there are so many little intimate details that it almost creates a unique moment that you can't identify with. You know, the awkwardness of the hand motion, the details of the, you know, folds on her neck, or just like the little bodily flaws create a sense of both an emotion and unique, essentially a unique setting. There is nothing anonymous about this. It is very clearly two people. Even without knowing anything about this scene or the context, you can tell there's an emotion involved. And that thus allows room for identification, which can thus allow for desire. And to clarify on that point, because otherwise I guess I didn't go as much into detail with it earlier, through identifying with someone, you are able to find difference, because in identifying with them, you can see the areas where you are both similar and different. I mean, it's almost like if you think about in the way you relate to another person, in order to see someone's point of view, you have to first be able to see from, you know, to put yourself in their shoes, essentially. And I believe that the creation of desire in queer female film is very much related to that idea of being able to, I guess, acknowledge another's personhood. So looking at these two shots here, even though, once again, no context and simply still shots, you can definitely see the differences in the qualities I outlined in the rubric. So on the left, it's very posed. You have lighting that I wish that I had a clip of, because it was so funny in the way that it changed from just kind of neutral lighting to this, like, you know, low lighting, highlighting, contouring lighting, essentially. The music also changed dramatically. And then the scene, they just abruptly cut to another scene afterward with no explanation for the transition in lighting. But you essentially can tell that this is a very purely sexual scene, but there's no real emotion and there's not much identifying about these characters in this moment. Whereas the scene on the right is very clearly emotional, even though it's not cropped in. You have a naked woman, but her body is not emphasized. If anything, her posture is. The woman who is unclothed is confident, while the woman who is clothed seems clearly nervous just with her posture. So in both of these, you know, the cropping left to right, cropped in close to highlight bodily appearance versus left, you know, cropped out or panned out in order to show relationship between the characters. The lighting, one is very flattering, the other remained the same as in the rest of the diegesis. And then the narrative significance, once again, you can't see that from a picture, but the scene on the left, which was from the 1996 film Bound, was, while these characters had a relationship, this moment did not move this story forward whatsoever. Whereas the one on the right, it's actually interesting because this is not an inherently romantic movie. The woman on the, I believe on the right, is a sex worker. And there's still plenty of emotion and subjectivity involved, but it's not related to romance, which is one concern I had in working on this project, because I wanted to make clear that queer female sexuality does not have to be inherently romantic or emotional, but identification and personhood is so important to the experience, and the ability to identify with fully fleshed out characters. Because in that identification, you were able to establish the differences in subjectivity and personhood as opposed to physical body that create that space for difference. So I worked on this project nearly over a year ago now, and frankly, I'm still not sure I fully understand the female gaze. It's very complicated because we really don't talk about female desire a lot as a culture in art or academia or anywhere else as much as we should, and that's doubly so for queer female desire. And my main goal with this was just to begin to look at what cinematic language might define a queer female gaze, if nothing else, so people could begin to push back against my definitions to create a more nuanced discussion that extended past the realm of the purely theoretical. And unfortunately, of course, you know, so much of this sort of thing is entirely theoretical. We can only really know our own experiences, and viewer and spectatorial experience is always going to vary from person to person. But I will say that there is a tangible difference in these two different ways of filming female bodies. And maybe what I have defined as the queer female gaze is just the absence of the male gaze, but there are certain qualities in that preservation of the character's identity and personhood that definitely adds another quality to sexual scenes. So my goal with this was just to create a starting place to talk about these issues, and I hope that, if nothing else, it's raised some questions for anybody watching this. I would love to engage with anybody who has more ideas or wants to push back, because I'm still trying to figure all of this out. But I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Take care.